Some folks say home is where you hang your hat, but I reckon home is where someone waits for you to come back. The wind howled through the empty streets of Copper Creek, Montana, carrying the faint scent of dust and pine. The air was dry, the kind that made your throat ache after too much time under the open sky. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the station platform, her heart heavy with the weight of a future she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her boots clicked softly against the weathered wood, the sound sharp in the silence of the late afternoon. She'd been traveling for days, but this was where it had brought her, this lonely little town, with no promises of warmth, no promises of a future. Just a letter, a promise from a stranger. She hadn't asked for much in life. All she wanted was a place to belong, a chance to start over. She wasn't even sure if that was what this place would give her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the crumpled letter, the only piece of hope she'd carried with her. She wasn't young anymore, not by the standards that mattered here. The letter had arrived weeks ago, tucked into her post at the boarding house, signed by a man named Luke Harper, a rancher, a cowboy who needed a wife. But what Emily didn't know was that Luke's life had already been changed in ways he couldn't quite fix, and that he might not be ready for someone like her to come along. The train station was nearly empty, the sound of its whistle still echoing faintly as it disappeared into the distance. The few townsfolk milling about barely gave her a second glance, their eyes moving over her as if she were just another passing stranger. No one had come to meet her. No one had even bothered to look twice. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight, but she refused to let the tears come. She had learned long ago that tears didn't do a woman any good. The few people who had chosen to speak with her had said the same thing. Stay away from Luke Harper. He's not a man to be trusted. Emily didn't know what to make of that. She didn't know Luke Harper, but she knew what it felt like to be cast aside, to be left alone to wonder if anyone could ever see past what you were on the outside. The wind picked up, swirling dust around her feet, and the town's few remaining residents disappeared into their own little corners of Copper Creek. And that's when she saw him. He didn't look like the others. His broad shoulders were set beneath the weight of something heavier than just a cowboy's work. His eyes, dark and distant, studied her for a long moment, almost as if trying to see through her. He didn't say a word, but something in the way he carried himself, the way he stood, told Emily everything she needed to know. This wasn't going to be the fairy tale she'd imagined. But maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to change the story. He stepped closer, and though his face remained unreadable, Emily could feel his gaze shift, steady and calculating. And when he spoke, his voice was low, rough around the edges like gravel scraping against stone. Are you Emily Carter? She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. He studied her for another long moment before stepping forward, closing the gap between them. I'm Luke Harper, he said, his tone flat but not unkind. Let's get you settled in. There's work to be done. Emily didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she was ready for whatever came next. But one thing she knew for sure. She had already made the choice to be here, and she wasn't turning back. Not now. Not ever. The cabin was smaller than Emily had expected. The walls, made from weathered logs, gave the place a warm, rustic feel, but it also smelled of dust and neglect. The wooden floor creaked beneath her boots as she stepped inside, taking in her new surroundings. Luke moved around her with quiet efficiency, removing his coat and hat, hanging them by the door as if this were just another day. He didn't say much, but she didn't mind. She wasn't sure what to expect from him, but she knew the silence wasn't out of rudeness. It was something deeper, something harder to read. You'll be sleeping in the loft, he said finally, his voice a low rumble. I'll take the cot below. No need for a fuss. She nodded, not knowing what else to say. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. She had been brought here to help, to live, and to survive in this harsh, unfamiliar place. But Emily wasn't sure if she was ready for the quiet that seemed to envelop Luke, the coldness that followed him wherever he went. He wasn't the man she had expected, the one she had imagined in her fantasies. He was something else, something broken, and that, in itself, was both a challenge and a mystery. Emily moved slowly, unpacking the few things she had brought with her. Her mother's quilts, some worn dresses, and a few pieces of precious china that had survived the journey. She placed them carefully in the small space Luke had designated for her belongings, trying to make it feel like home, even if just for a moment. Luke didn't offer to help, but his eyes followed her movements, as if he were watching her every step. He didn't speak, but his presence seemed to fill the room in ways that words never could. As the evening wore on, the silence between them grew thicker, but Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of it settle around her. She wasn't sure what had brought Luke to this point in his life. She had heard the rumors in town, whispers about his past, about his lost wife and the pain that still clung to him like a shadow. But Emily didn't come here to dig into his wounds. She had her own scars, her own story to tell. She would wait. She would show him that she wasn't just another person passing through. She was here to stay. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth a comfort against the chill of the evening. Emily glanced over at Luke, who had settled by the table, his hands folded in front of him. He was distant, as though his mind was somewhere far away, but she could see the flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps curiosity, beneath his hard exterior. "I'll make dinner tomorrow," Emily said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Luke looked up, his gaze meeting hers for the first time that evening. His eyes were dark, weary, but there was a hint of something else, something she couldn't quite place. "That's fine," he replied, his voice steady. "Don't expect it to be easy around here. The work's tough, and it's not always kind." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of his words, but she wasn't afraid. Not yet. She had come here with nothing left to lose. Maybe, in time, she could help him find something to believe in again. And maybe, just maybe, he could teach her how to start over, how to heal the wounds she had carried for so long. The next morning, the air outside was crisp, and the sun had barely begun to rise over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the mountains. Emily sat up in the loft, the thin blankets tangled around her legs as she stretched. The silence of the cabin was peaceful, but it also felt heavy. Luke had already left for his morning chores. He had a way of disappearing into the day, working in a rhythm that didn't seem to need anyone else. Emily watched the last of the firewood crackle and die out, leaving only the faint smell of burning pine in the air. She sighed and stood up, deciding to begin the day. The small kitchen was sparse but functional. There were jars of preserves and sacks of flour that Emily had seen the day before. She moved around quietly, gathering the ingredients she needed. She hadn't cooked for anyone in a long time, and it felt strange to be preparing a meal for someone she barely knew. But it also gave her a sense of purpose, something to hold on to. Emily worked with the same careful precision her mother had taught her, measuring out flour for biscuits and stirring the batter slowly. The cabin wasn't much, but it was hers now, and she was determined to make it work. When the biscuits were in the oven, she turned her attention to the stove, where she began to heat some beans. She worked quietly, her thoughts drifting between the present and the past. She thought about her mother, about the life she had left behind in the city. She thought about the man she was cooking for, Luke Harper, and how little she truly knew him. Emily had heard bits and pieces from the townsfolk about his past, about the tragedy that had shaped him. But no one really spoke openly. It was as if they were all afraid to say too much, afraid to uncover something that might hurt. She had seen the scars on his face, the way his eyes seemed distant, like he carried a heavy burden with him wherever he went. Emily wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but she could see that there was more to Luke than the man he presented to the world. He had a way of holding back, of keeping everything inside. But that wasn't something she was used to. She had lived most of her life being open, being willing to share the things that weighed on her heart. Maybe that's what made them different. Emily didn't know why she had come here, why she had chosen to leave behind everything she knew. Maybe it was for a new start, or maybe it was simply because she had nowhere else to go. But as she looked around the cabin, she knew she had to make the best of it. And maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to break through Luke's walls. Maybe she could show him that there was still room for love in a life that had known so much loss. The sound of boots on the porch broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Luke standing in the doorway, his hands resting on the frame. He looked tired, but there was something different about him today. He wasn't as distant as usual. "Smells good," he said, his voice soft, though still rough around the edges. Emily smiled, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. "It's nothing fancy," she replied, her voice a little shakier than she intended. "Just biscuits and beans. I hope that's all right." Luke stepped inside, removing his hat and wiping his boots on the mat before stepping further into the room. His eyes scanned the small kitchen, lingering on the table where she had set out the food. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "It's fine," he said, his gaze finally meeting hers. "Better than I expected." They both sat down at the table, the silence between them comfortable for the moment. Emily reached for the biscuits, breaking one in half, and offered him a piece. He took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and for a moment, Emily felt a small flicker of connection. She wasn't sure if it was just the quiet of the morning or something more, but for the first time, she felt like maybe this could work. She wasn't just a stranger in his house anymore. Maybe, in time, she could be someone who mattered to him. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the one who finally showed her that she wasn't as lost as she felt. The day stretched on quietly. They ate their meal without speaking much, the soft clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. But Emily felt something shift. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to make her think that, despite the loneliness that had brought her here, there was a chance for something more. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Emily woke early, as she had always done, and spent her mornings preparing breakfast, feeding the chickens, and tending to the small garden outside the cabin. Luke had his own tasks, always working with a sense of urgency that made Emily wonder if he ever slowed down. She had learned quickly that the ranch didn't wait for anyone. There was always something to fix, something to tend to. She had expected the work to be hard, but it wasn't just the physical labor that wore on her, it was the silence. Luke never spoke much, and when he did, his words were short and to the point. It wasn't that he was rude, just distant, as though he carried a weight on his shoulders that kept him from opening up. Emily didn't mind at first. She was used to silence, used to being alone in her thoughts. But over time, she began to wonder if she would ever get through to him. One evening, as the sun began to set, Emily found herself standing at the edge of the porch, looking out over the land. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the cool breeze brought with it the scent of pine and earth. She felt a strange pull to the land, a connection to something deeper than she had expected. Luke had been working on the far side of the property all day, and for the first time, Emily found herself feeling the absence of his presence. It wasn't a longing, more like an empty space she hadn't noticed until it was gone. She heard the sound of boots crunching on the gravel path, and a moment later, Luke appeared on the porch, his shirt dusty from the day's work. His eyes were dark, the usual distance between them still there, but something else lingered in the way he looked at her. It was fleeting, but Emily caught it. A glimpse of something buried deep inside him, something that hadn't quite been buried enough. "I saw you out here," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of curiosity. "Thought I'd check in." Emily turned to face him, her heart suddenly beating a little faster. She hadn't expected him to speak, not like this, and it threw her off guard. "Just thinking," she replied, unsure of what to say. About what? His question wasn't pressing, but it felt more like an invitation than anything else. Emily hesitated. She had never been good at talking about feelings, especially not with someone she barely knew. But something about the way he asked made her want to open up, just a little. "About how things have been," she said slowly. "About how quiet everything is. It's strange, isn't it? How quiet everything is out here." Luke stood for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped closer to her, his boots scraping against the porch as he moved. He stood beside her, looking out over the land just as she had moments before. The silence between them felt different now, not uncomfortable, but soft, as if the space between them wasn't filled with distance, but with understanding. "It's always quiet here," Luke said quietly. "Too quiet sometimes." Emily turned to look at him, trying to read the lines of his face. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the burden he carried but never spoke of. She didn't know if he'd ever tell her what had happened, what had brought him to this point, but she could see it in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself. "You don't have to be alone, you know," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze intense but not unkind. It was as if he were searching her for something, trying to figure out if she meant what she said. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I don't know if I can let anyone in," he admitted, his voice soft but raw. "I've been carrying this for so long. It's easier to stay closed off." Emily didn't know what to say. She had never been in his shoes, never carried the kind of pain he had. But she understood what it meant to be alone, to feel like no one could see you for who you truly were. It doesn't have to be easy, she said gently. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Luke's eyes softened, just a little, but he said nothing more. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something he had been reluctant to admit. Emily didn't push him, didn't ask for more. She simply stood beside him, both of them looking out over the land in the quiet of the evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shadow, but for the first time since she had arrived, Emily felt like maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they both thought. The days blurred into each other as Emily settled deeper into her life at the ranch. The early mornings were always the same, cool, still, with the air smelling of pine and earth. She would wake before the sun, the familiar quiet of the cabin her only company. She had come to appreciate the stillness, but also the solitude. Luke remained mostly distant, always focused on his work, but there was a shift in him, something subtle, like the first signs of spring after a long, harsh winter. One morning, Emily stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun rise slowly over the hills. She had always found peace in mornings like this, where the world seemed to pause for just a moment before the day started. Luke had left early, as usual, to tend to the horses. He had been working with them more often lately, and Emily noticed that his hands were always covered in dirt, his shirt stained with sweat. She didn't mind. It was the way he worked, the way he kept to himself. But she couldn't help but wonder what it would take to bring him out of the quiet, to pull him from the shadows he had hidden in for so long. She set about her morning routine, making biscuits, brewing coffee, and preparing for the day ahead. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was hers now, and for the first time, she felt a sense of belonging in it. The cabin, once foreign and uncomfortable, had started to feel like home. It wasn't just the work that kept her occupied, it was the way she had come to see Luke differently. The first time she had arrived at the ranch, he had been an enigma to her, a man who seemed untouchable, unreachable. But now, as the days passed, she began to understand him more. It wasn't about the things he said or didn't say. It was in the small things, the way he worked, the way he moved, the quiet strength he carried with him. She saw the scars on his face, the way his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the world. She knew there was more to him than what he let others see. It was in his silence, in the way he kept his emotions locked away. Emily didn't understand it, not completely, but she felt a growing desire to break through. Later that morning, after breakfast, Emily stepped outside to check on the garden. It was still small, but it was beginning to grow. The first signs of spring were all around her. New buds on the trees, the smell of fresh earth, and the distant sound of birds. She knelt down to pull a few weeds when she heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind her. She turned to see Luke approaching, his hands still covered in dirt, his face drawn with exhaustion. "How's it going?" Emily asked, standing up and brushing her hands off. Luke stopped a few feet away, looking at her with a quiet intensity. His eyes, usually so distant, seemed to soften slightly as he looked at her. "It's fine," he replied, his voice low but steady. Emily could sense the walls he had built around himself, the way he kept his emotions tightly in check. But she also felt something else, an openness, a willingness to let her in, even if just a little. She stepped closer to him, not sure why she was doing it, but feeling an undeniable pull. "You don't have to do everything by yourself, you know," she said softly. Luke's gaze shifted, and for a moment, Emily thought he might say something, but then he looked away. "I've always done things on my own," he muttered. "It's easier that way." Emily studied him for a moment, watching the way his shoulders tensed at the words. She knew. There was more to it, more to his silence, more to his distance than he was willing to admit. But for the first time, she didn't feel like pushing. She simply stood beside him, the space between them filled with the quiet hum of the ranch. She wasn't sure if he was ready to talk, ready to let someone in, but she knew she would be there when he was. It wasn't about fixing him or solving his problems. It was about being there, offering the kind of quiet support he hadn't known he needed. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in its own way, as the day continued on. There was no rush. Emily understood that now. It would take time. But in the stillness of that moment, she felt a sense of connection, a sense that, just maybe, they were both beginning to heal. As the sun climbed higher, Emily turned back to the garden, Luke still standing beside her. Neither of them said much more, but the quiet felt different now, softer, like something had shifted, like maybe they were both beginning to find their way home. The days grew longer, and the work on the ranch never seemed to end. Emily's mornings were filled with chores, while Luke continued to focus on the tasks that kept him busy. Though their lives had begun to settle into a routine, Emily felt a strange tension between them, something unsaid, something that lingered just below the surface. She knew Luke was changing, bit by bit, but it was slow, and the quiet between them often felt heavier than it should have. One afternoon, after they had finished working in the fields, Emily sat on the porch, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The air was warm, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing breaking the stillness. Luke was standing by the barn, his back to her as he worked on the fence. She noticed that he had started to move more slowly, as if the weight of his work was taking its toll. It was in those moments, when he wasn't looking, that she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged under the burden of his thoughts. She had tried to talk to him before, but he always shut her out, as if he feared that speaking about his pain would make it real. Emily didn't know how to reach him, how to get past the walls he had built around himself. But she refused to give up. She knew what it felt like to be alone, to carry pain in silence. She wasn't going to let him do the same. As the evening stretched on, Emily walked down to the barn, her steps slow but purposeful. She could hear Luke working inside, the sound of wood being hammered into place. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him, but then she pushed the door open. Luke looked up as she stepped inside, his brow furrowed slightly as he noticed her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind outside. "You look like you could use a break," Emily said softly, her voice gentle but firm. Luke didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his hands resting on the fence, his expression unreadable. Emily stepped closer, her heart beating faster as she closed the distance between them. "Luke," she said quietly, "you don't have to do everything by yourself." He finally looked at her, his gaze intense, as if he were searching her face for something. "I've always done it alone," he said, his voice low and almost weary. "It's easier that way." Emily's heart tightened at the words. She could hear the years of pain in his voice, the weight of all the things he hadn't said. But she didn't back down. She reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said softly. For a moment, Luke didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes closed for a brief second, as if he were processing her words, letting them sink in. Emily could feel the tension in him, the resistance that had always been there, but she refused to let him push her away. She wasn't asking for him to share everything, not all at once. She just wanted him to know that he didn't have to keep everything inside. He didn't have to carry the weight of the world by himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Luke spoke. His voice was rough, but there was something in it, something softer than usual. "I don't know how to let anyone in," he admitted quietly. Emily's hand stayed on his arm, her touch light but steady. "You don't have to know," she said, her voice reassuring. "You just have to be willing to try." Luke didn't say anything else, but the way he stood there, the way his posture seemed to soften just a little, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't ready to let go of everything, but maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that he didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with something else, something hopeful, something that felt like the beginning of something new. Emily smiled softly, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since she had arrived, she felt like there was a chance for something more. And maybe, just maybe, they both could heal, one small step at a time. The mornings had become a quiet rhythm between them. Emily would wake up to the soft light creeping through the window, the cool mountain air filling the cabin as she made her way down to the kitchen. It had taken some time, but she had found her place in this new life, and though the work was hard, it didn't feel as heavy as it had at first. Luke continued to keep his distance, but his presence wasn't as oppressive as before. They worked alongside each other, exchanged simple words, and found comfort in the routine that had settled between them. He still didn't share much about his past, but the small gestures, the way his eyes softened when he passed her a tool, the slight nod of acknowledgement when she did something right, made her feel like they were inching closer to something real. One morning, after a long day of repairing the barn roof, Luke appeared at the porch as the sun began to set. He stood there for a moment, watching her as she watered the garden. Emily didn't notice him right away, lost in her task, but when she did, she felt her heart skip a beat. He was leaning against the frame of the door, arms crossed, looking at her with an intensity that made her nervous, but also made her wonder if maybe he was beginning to let her in. "It looks good," he said, his voice low, but the words were sincere. Emily smiled, trying to hide the warmth that spread through her at the compliment. "It's coming along," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. Luke stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. "You've got a good touch with this," he said, glancing at the garden. Emily nodded, still a little unsure of what to say. "I've always liked working with my hands," she said softly. "It helps keep my mind from wandering too much." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Luke seemed to be thinking, his gaze distant as he looked out toward the horizon. Emily could tell there was something weighing on him, something he wasn't ready to say. She wondered if he would ever open up about what had happened to him. "You know," Emily said, breaking the silence, "I didn't think I'd ever find a place like this. It's hard work, but it's honest work." Luke glanced at her, and for a moment, his expression softened. "It is," he agreed quietly, "but it's also lonely." Emily felt her heart ache at his words. She had sensed the loneliness in him for a while, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel even more real. She had always thought that he had built those walls around himself to protect whatever pain lay beneath, but now she wasn't so sure. "It doesn't have to be," Emily said gently, looking up at him. "You don't have to be alone." Luke's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Emily saw something in his gaze that wasn't guarded. It was vulnerable, something raw and unspoken, and it made her heart ache for him. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at her with those dark eyes. Emily stood there, waiting, unsure if he would open up or if he would retreat into silence like he always did. But then, in a quiet voice, Luke finally spoke. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice rough. "I don't know how to let anyone in. I've been alone for so long." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Emily could feel the truth in them, and it hurt her in a way she hadn't expected. He had been carrying his pain for so long, and now that she was here, he didn't know how to let go of it. Emily stepped closer to him, her voice soft and steady. "You don't have to figure it all out at once," she said gently. "You don't have to let go of everything, but you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Luke's eyes softened, and for the first time, he didn't look away. It was a small moment, but to Emily, it felt like a breakthrough. She didn't know if Luke was ready to let go of all the pain he had kept buried for so long, but she was willing to be there when he was. She wasn't asking for him to change overnight. She wasn't asking for anything at all. She was just offering him something he hadn't had in years, someone who would stay. They stood there for a while, the silence no longer uncomfortable but filled with understanding. As the sun dipped lower behind the hills, Emily realized that she didn't need words to bridge the gap between them. Sometimes, the quiet was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was how they would both heal, slowly, together, without needing to say it all at once. The next few weeks passed by in a blur of hard work and quiet moments. Emily had become accustomed to the rhythm of life on the ranch. The mornings were spent tending to the animals, cleaning the barn, and working in the garden, while the afternoons were for the larger tasks, fixing fences, repairing the roof, or working the land. Luke continued to keep his distance, but there was something different about him now. He didn't retreat as much, and though he still held back in many ways, there was a softening in his eyes when he looked at her, a small but noticeable change. One evening, after a long day of work, Emily sat outside on the porch, the cool evening air wrapping around her like a blanket. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of purple and orange. Luke had been silent all day, working with the horses, his face set in the usual grim expression. She had learned to give him space, but tonight, something felt different. Emily could sense that he was more restless than usual, a tension in the air that she couldn't ignore. She watched as he walked toward the barn, his hands stuffed in his pockets. He was moving with purpose, but there was a weariness in his steps, like something was weighing heavily on him. Without thinking, Emily stood up and walked toward him. As she approached, she noticed the way his shoulders tensed, as if he were preparing for something, perhaps to turn her away. "Luke," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. He stopped in his tracks and turned slowly to face her, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. Luke's eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and something else, something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a small sigh, Luke spoke, his voice rougher than usual. "I don't know, Emily," he said quietly. "I've been doing this for so long, carrying everything by myself. I don't know how to share it, not with anyone. And I don't know how to let go." The vulnerability in his words hit Emily like a wave. She had known that he was struggling, but hearing it from him, hearing the weight in his voice, was different. It was the first time he had admitted it, even if only to her. Emily took a deep breath, her heart aching for him. She walked closer, her steps slow and deliberate. When she reached him, she stopped and placed a hand gently on his arm, her touch light but steady. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself," she said softly. "You don't have to keep everything inside." Luke looked at her then, his dark eyes searching her face, as if he were trying to decide if he could trust her, if he could let her in. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the unspoken things that had lingered for so long. Emily could feel the walls he had built around himself, but she didn't step back. She didn't retreat. She stayed, offering him the quiet strength he needed. "I'm here," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere. And you don't have to hide from me." For a long moment, Luke didn't respond. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on hers, as if weighing her words. Emily could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between wanting to open up and being too afraid to. And then, just when she thought he might pull away again, something shifted. His posture softened, just a little, and he let out a breath he had been holding. "I don't know how to be different," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let anyone in." Emily smiled softly, a warmth spreading through her chest. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," she said gently. "You don't have to change everything. Just take one step at a time." Luke's eyes flickered with something, perhaps hope, or maybe just the slightest bit of relief. He didn't say anything, but for the first time in a long time, Emily saw a shift in him, a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. They stood there in the silence of the evening, the sky darkening above them, and for a moment, Emily felt a sense of peace. She didn't need him to open up all at once. She didn't need him to change overnight. But in that quiet, she knew that things were slowly beginning to shift, that maybe, just maybe, they both were learning how to let go of the past and take the first steps toward healing. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around them, and Luke, after a long pause, placed his hand over hers, his grip warm and steady. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Enough for Emily to know that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to move forward, together. The days continued to pass in the quiet hum of the ranch, each one flowing into the next like the steady rhythm of a well-worn path. Emily had settled into the routine, the work feeling less like a burden and more like a purpose. The garden was thriving, the chickens laid their eggs with regularity, and the barn, once in need of so much repair, had become a place that felt whole again. Luke still worked hard, often disappearing into the long stretches of the ranch, but Emily noticed the small changes in him. The subtle way he began to open up when they spoke, the brief moments when his eyes softened, even if he didn't say much. One afternoon, Emily found herself standing on the porch, watching Luke from a distance as he worked with the horses. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the ranch. She knew he had been struggling with the weight of his past for so long, but something about the way he moved today was different. He wasn't as tense, not as closed off. Emily had noticed this shift over the past few weeks. His silence, while still present, no longer felt like a wall. She could see that he was beginning to let go, piece by piece. As she watched him, a sense of peace washed over her. She had come here, unsure of what she was looking for, but now she realized that what she had found wasn't just a place to escape to. It was a place to grow, to heal. She wasn't sure if Luke realized it, but he had started to let her in, just a little, and it made her believe that maybe, someday, he would let her help him carry some of the weight he had been holding for so long. When Luke finally approached the porch, his face was streaked with sweat, and there was a look of exhaustion in his eyes. But there was something else there too, something softer, something more open. Emily stood up as he reached the steps, meeting his gaze with a small smile. "You look tired," she said, her voice warm with concern. Luke paused for a moment, his gaze shifting away before he looked back at her. "It's been a long day," he replied, his voice rough but not as distant as it had once been. Emily stepped closer to him, feeling the familiar weight of the silence between them, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. "You don't have to do everything yourself," she said softly. Luke's eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a small sigh, Luke nodded. "I know," he said quietly. "It's just hard to ask for help sometimes." Emily reached out, placing her hand on his arm in a gentle, reassuring gesture. "You don't have to ask," she said softly. "I'm here." Luke looked down at her hand for a moment, then back into her eyes. "I don't know what to do with that," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. Emily smiled, her heart softening at his words. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "You just have to let me be here." For a long moment, Luke didn't say anything. He simply stood there, his gaze focused on her, as if he were weighing her words. Then, with a slight nod, he slowly reached up and placed his hand over hers, his grip warm and steady. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her, a sense that, after everything, they were finally beginning to understand each other. The air around them seemed to quiet, the world slowing down as they stood there, connected in a way that neither had expected. As the night began to fall, Luke finally spoke again, his voice softer than before. "Maybe I've been too hard on myself," he said quietly. "Maybe I've been too afraid to let anyone see the parts of me I've been hiding." Emily didn't answer at first. She simply squeezed his hand, offering him the quiet understanding she had come to know. The silence between them now was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with something deeper, something that spoke of trust, of patience, of the slow and steady healing they were both learning to embrace. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Emily knew that they weren't quite there yet, but they were closer. And for the first time, it felt like they were heading in the right direction. Together, the days grew warmer, and with each passing morning, Emily found herself feeling more at home on the ranch. The garden she had worked so hard on had begun to flourish, and the chickens were laying more eggs than she could keep up with. There was a quiet satisfaction in the work, a sense of accomplishment that came from seeing things grow, from creating something that would last. Luke continued to work by her side, though his silence was still ever present. They had settled into a rhythm of sorts, where words were not always necessary. It wasn't that Luke had changed overnight, but there was a subtle difference in the way he looked at her, in the way he occasionally shared a few words with her. It wasn't much, but it was progress. One evening, as they finished their work for the day, Emily found herself standing by the barn, watching the sun dip below the hills. She had learned to appreciate these quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause and everything felt still. Luke appeared beside her, his boots heavy on the ground as he walked toward her. He didn't say anything at first, but there was something in the way he stood next to her, something unspoken. For a moment, they simply stood there in silence, watching the sky change colors as the sun set. "You've been working hard," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. Luke glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "It's the work that keeps me going," he said quietly, his voice steady but distant. Emily nodded, understanding more than he realized. She had come to know that the ranch was more than just a livelihood for him. It was a way to keep the past at bay, to bury the hurt he carried so deeply. She didn't know the details of his past, and she hadn't pushed him to share, but she could see it in his eyes. He was trying, in his own way, to heal. "I don't mind the work," she said softly, looking out at the land. "It feels meaningful." Luke's gaze followed hers, taking in the horizon as if seeing it for the first time. "I never thought much about it," he admitted, his voice low. "It was just something to do, something to keep the mind busy. But maybe you're right." Emily glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. "You're not just building fences and fixing roofs," she said gently. "You're building something that matters. You're building a life." For the first time in what felt like forever, Luke's eyes met hers, and this time, there was no wall between them. His gaze was steady, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said quietly, his voice a little rough. "Maybe that's what I've been afraid of all along." Emily didn't need to ask what he meant. She understood. It wasn't the work that had kept him going. It was the fear of opening up, of letting someone in. The fear of letting himself believe that something good could come out of all the pain he had endured. "It's okay to be afraid," she said softly. "But you don't have to be afraid of me." Luke stood still for a moment, as if contemplating her words. Then, slowly, he reached out, his hand brushing hers for the briefest of moments. Emily's heart skipped a beat at the touch, the contact so simple, yet so meaningful. It wasn't much, but it was everything. In that moment, Emily realized that they had both come so far. They weren't perfect, and they hadn't figured it all out, but they were learning to navigate the quiet, learning to trust each other in ways they hadn't thought possible. As the night settled in, they stood together, side by side, no longer strangers, but something more, something real. Emily didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. She knew that healing wasn't a straight line, that it would take time, but she also knew that they didn't have to walk the road alone anymore. Not anymore. The following weeks unfolded quietly, the steady rhythm of life on the ranch becoming more familiar with each passing day. Emily had found a sense of peace in the work, the routine that had once felt overwhelming now giving her a sense of purpose. There was something grounding about the simplicity of it all. The mornings were spent tending to the garden and the animals, the afternoons with the heavy tasks of repairing the barn or fixing fences, and the evenings, when the sun set low over the land, were always a quiet reprieve. Luke continued to work just as hard, but there was a shift in him. Emily noticed it in the way he didn't retreat as much into his solitude, the way his gaze softened when their eyes met, the way he no longer pulled away when she spoke. It wasn't that he had opened up completely. She knew that would take time, but it was something. She felt it in the small moments. The way he lingered for a second longer when they passed each other, the way he offered her a quiet smile after a long day's work. It was different, and it made Emily believe that there was hope for both of them. One evening, as the golden light of dusk filtered through the trees, Emily found herself walking toward the barn. Luke was already there, his hands busy with the horses, brushing them down after a long day. She stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him in the soft evening light. There was something about the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his actions, that made her heart stir. For the first time, she didn't just see the man who had been guarded and distant for so long. She saw him for who he was, someone who had carried too much for too long, but who was now slowly learning to let it go. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but she had fallen into the quiet strength he offered, the way he made her feel like she wasn't alone in this world. She didn't need grand gestures, she realized. Just the moments like this, standing beside him, knowing they didn't have to fill the silence with words. "Need some help?" Emily asked, her voice soft but steady. Luke paused, his hand still on the horse's mane as he turned to look at her. His eyes were tired, but there was something else in them, something she hadn't seen before, vulnerability, maybe, or just the slightest hint of something deeper. "I've got it," he replied, but there was no real edge to his voice. "But it's nice to have someone around." Emily smiled, her heart light. "I'm always here," she said quietly. Luke didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he just nodded and returned to his work. They didn't need more words than that. Emily stepped inside the barn and moved to the other side, quietly assisting with the horses. As they worked side by side, the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with tension, but with something softer. Emily could feel the change in him, feel it in the way he no longer kept her at arm's length. She knew he wasn't ready to pour his heart out to her. Not yet, maybe not ever, but that was okay. She didn't need all of his secrets. She just needed him to know that she would be there, that she wouldn't walk away when it got hard. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Luke finished with the horses, wiping his hands on his trousers before turning to Emily. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice quiet but genuine. Emily smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "Anytime." And as they stood there in the quiet of the barn, with the evening wrapping around them like a blanket, Emily realized that this quiet understanding between them was enough for now. They didn't need to rush anything. They had time. Time to grow, time to heal, and time to learn how to trust again. And in that moment, with the horses settled and the night stretching out ahead of them, Emily felt more at peace than she ever had. This was what she had come for. This quiet, steady life, with all its imperfections, and with Luke by her side, maybe, just maybe, they could both find the healing they needed. The days began to blend together in the most comfortable way. The seasons were slowly shifting, and with it, the work on the ranch seemed to take on a new rhythm. Emily had found a peace she hadn't known existed, a quiet joy in the routine of everyday life. She still worked the garden, tended to the chickens, and helped Luke with the heavier tasks. But now, there was something more to it. There was a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose she had been missing for so long. The mornings were no longer just a task to be completed, they were moments of clarity. Luke, too, had changed. Emily could see it in the way he moved, in the way he worked alongside her with less distance between them. He was still a man of few words, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like a shared understanding. There were still days when he retreated into himself, days when the weight of his past seemed to return, but Emily had come to learn how to let those moments pass. She knew now that healing wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a slow, steady process, one that required patience and trust. One afternoon, as Emily was finishing her work in the garden, she noticed Luke standing by the fence, looking out at the horizon. The sky was painted with the orange and pink hues of the setting sun, and for a moment, it seemed like the world was holding its breath. Emily walked toward him, the grass beneath her feet soft from the recent rain. As she approached, she could see the lines of exhaustion on Luke's face, but there was something else in his eyes, a softness she hadn't seen before. "Long day?" she asked, her voice gentle. Luke turned to her, his gaze meeting hers for the briefest of moments before he nodded. "Just the usual," he said, his voice low but not distant. "It's never easy, is it?" Emily said, her heart aching for him. She had come to understand the weight of the work, the responsibility that came with running the ranch. But she also knew it wasn't just the work that weighed on him. It was the silence, the years of carrying everything alone. Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the ground, his gaze distant. Emily stood quietly beside him, not pushing, just offering her presence. After a long pause, Luke spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I never thought I'd be able to share any of it," he admitted, his words quiet, almost hesitant. "But maybe it's time." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to open up, not like this. She turned to face him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You don't have to share everything, Luke," she said softly. "But I'm here, whenever you're ready." Luke's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, Emily saw a flicker of something. Trust, maybe, or hope. It was fleeting, but it was there. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm trying." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. She didn't need him to be perfect. She didn't need him to open up all at once. She just needed him to know that he wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time, she truly believed that maybe, just maybe, Luke was beginning to believe it too. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a soft glow over the land. They stood there for a while, side by side, not speaking, but not needing to. It was enough. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and for now, that was enough. Emily realized, in that moment, that she wasn't just living on this land anymore. She was a part of it. And with Luke beside her, they were building something together, something real, something that mattered. The seasons began to change more noticeably as the crisp air of autumn settled over the ranch. The mornings were cool, the sun rising later and later as the days shortened, but the quiet of the land remained constant. Emily had come to love this time of year. The steady work of the ranch, the calm that filled the air, and the small victories of the harvest brought a deep satisfaction she hadn't expected. She had found a rhythm, a balance between the work she did and the life she shared with Luke. Luke had become a quiet presence in her days, his steady work and simple gestures speaking volumes. She still hadn't heard the full details of his past, but she didn't press him. She understood now that some things took time, and that not every story needed to be told in one sitting. They had found their own unspoken language, a way of being that didn't rely on words. As the days grew shorter and the ranch settled into a calm lull, Emily found herself spending more time outside, walking the land, breathing in the cool, crisp air. The ranch had always been a place of hard work and quiet moments, but now, with Luke beside her, it felt like a home. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower behind the distant hills, Emily and Luke stood side by side at the edge of the pasture. Luke had been working with the horses, and Emily had spent the afternoon gathering firewood. The sky was painted in hues of gold and purple, the colors of the evening spreading across the land like a warm blanket. Luke turned to her, his gaze soft as he watched her. There was a moment of quiet, a comfortable silence that neither of them felt the need to fill. "It's peaceful here," Emily said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the backdrop of the wind. Luke nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "It is," he replied quietly. "I never thought I'd find peace again. But I think I'm starting to." Emily smiled, the words touching her heart in a way she hadn't expected. She had come to this place looking for a new start, but what she had found was something even more unexpected, a sense of belonging, of connection. She hadn't just found a place to heal, she had found someone to heal with. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore," she said gently, her voice filled with warmth and understanding. Luke's gaze shifted slightly, and for a moment, Emily saw something flicker in his eyes. It was small, but it was there, something like trust, like acceptance. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady but full of meaning. "I've been afraid for a long time, afraid to let anyone in. But I think I'm ready to try." Emily's heart swelled with emotion at his words. She hadn't expected him to say it, hadn't expected him to share this part of himself with her. But there it was, a small but significant step. "We don't have to do it all at once," she said softly, her voice filled with tenderness. "We can take it slow. We'll figure it out together." Luke didn't say anything at first, but the way he looked at her told her everything she needed to know. There was something different in his eyes, something open, something real. They stood together in the quiet of the evening, the weight of their shared understanding settling between them. The world felt still, as if time itself had paused for just a moment to let them catch up with the pace of their own hearts. It wasn't perfect, and there was still so much they didn't know about each other, but Emily realized that wasn't the point. The point was that they had found each other, and in that quiet, steady way, they were learning how to heal, how to trust, and how to build something real. The night stretched on, and as the stars began to appear in the sky above them, Emily knew that they had both taken a step forward, together, and that, in itself, was enough.